Gunshots tore through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Basilica, scattering shards of red and gold across the marble floor, where terrified wedding guests dropped to their knees. Audrey Lindqvist stared at the man gripping her hand, his other hand already drawing a weapon from beneath his tailored jacket, and understood in that instant that everything she thought she knew about him was a lie. He wasn't just a violinist, and she wasn't an orphan. The rain hammered against the windows of the Toronto Conservatory of Music, blurring the city lights into smears of amber and white. Inside the old stone practice hall, the air smelled of rosin and wet wool, and every soundproofed room down the hallway echoed faintly with scales and half-finished sonatas. Audrey Lindqvist sat hunched over a cello she didn't own, the rental sticker still peeling off the back, her bow arm trembling slightly from 3 hours of non-stop rehearsal. She was 23, a graduate performance student surviving on instant noodles, and a teaching assistantship that barely covered her rent in Parkdale. Her mother, Ingrid, had died 11 months earlier of a heart condition nobody had caught in time. And since then Audrey had been entirely, completely alone. Down the corridor, in the smallest and least used rehearsal room, a man sat with a violin case unopened beside him and a laptop he wasn't really looking at. Caspian Dragulescu didn't look like a typical conservatory student, even though he'd enrolled that semester under a name that wasn't quite his own. At 26, he carried himself with a careful, contained stillness, the kind that made people in elevators stand a little straighter without knowing why. He wore a charcoal overcoat that cost more than most of his classmates' tuition, and his eyes, when they moved like they were checking exits. Caspian was a courier and occasional enforcer for the Dragulescu organization, a Eastern European crime network that had quietly taken over half the import business along the Lake Ontario waterfront. He was enrolled in classes as cover, a way to explain his presence in the city, while a turf dispute with a rival outfit cooled down on the other side of the lake. Audrey pushed open the door to his room by mistake, looking for an empty practice space, and found him instead. "Sorry, is this taken?" she asked, exhaustion flattening her voice. "Every other room's full, and I have a jury in 2 days." He looked up, took in the dark circles under her eyes, the second-hand cardigan, the cello case that had been re-glued at the corner. He gestured without a word to the empty chair. "Thanks," she breathed, sinking into it. "It's a madhouse out there today." "Exam season," he said, his voice low, almost bored. He didn't look at her again. His eyes drifted instead to the small reinforced window in the door, watching the hallway. That was when he saw them. 2 men in long coats standing near the elevator bank where no student ever lingered. Late 40s, broad through the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with gyms. Caspian's pulse ticked up half a beat. He recognized the taller one, Anton Reyes, a fixer for the Marchetti family, the Dragulescus' bitterest rivals on the waterfront. His hand drifted instinctively toward the inside of his coat. But Reyes wasn't looking at Caspian. He was looking at the girl tuning her cello 3 feet away. "I'm Audrey, by the way," she said, oblivious, rosining her bow. Caspian eased his hand back down. "Caspian, you look like you'd rather be literally anywhere else," she said with a tired half-smile. "Don't worry, I won't talk your ear off. I just need somewhere quiet before this jury eats me alive." He studied her. She was completely unguarded, completely unaware, while 50 feet away 2 men who killed people for a living kept her in their sightline without once glancing at the room she actually sat in. They weren't hunting, they were watching over her. "You from the city?" he asked, keeping his tone idle. "Born and raised. Just me and my mum, growing up. She was an ICU nurse at St. Mike's, passed away last year." Audrey shrugged, the kind of shrug that meant it still hurt. "Never knew my dad. Mum said he was some businessman who left before I was born. Typical sad violin story. Pun intended." Caspian's mind began assembling fragments of underworld rumor he'd heard since he was a teenager, that 20-some years ago Anton Reyes's employer, a man named Victor Marchetti, had nearly died in an ambush outside a downtown hospital, saved by a young nurse who happened to be on shift. That for one reckless season, the most feared man on the waterfront had fallen in love. that somewhere out there was a daughter he'd hidden behind a wall of money and silence so complete that even his own captains weren't sure she existed. Caspian looked at the exhausted graduate student rosening her bow across the table from him. She had no idea that her biological father controlled 3 ports, half the construction permits in the GTA, and a net worth that would make his own bosses look like pickpockets. Audrey Lindqvist was Victor Marchetti's daughter. "I'm sorry about your mum," he said, quieter than he meant to. "It's okay," she said, and the smile she gave him was real, unguarded, warm enough that something in his chest tightened in a way he wasn't used to. "I'm getting by." He glanced past her, through the little window to where Anton Reyes was now watching him with open suspicion. If only you knew, Caspian thought. You're sitting across from the enemy. 3 weeks slid by in a blur of shared coffees from the cart outside the conservatory, late practice sessions that ran past midnight, quiet walks along the boardwalk when neither of them could sleep. Despite every instinct telling him not to, Caspian found himself pulled toward Audrey the way water finds the lowest point. She was everything his world wasn't. Open, unguarded, kind without calculation. For the first time since he was 19, he caught himself wanting to walk away from the only family that had ever paid him. To disappear into a life where his biggest problem was a jury performance instead of a federal indictment. But organizations like the one he worked for did not let people simply walk away. On a bitter Thursday night, Caspian was summoned to a cold storage facility near the port lands, the kind of place that smelled permanently of brine and diesel. In the back office, surrounded by stacked pallets, sat Dimitrios Marchenko, second in command of the Dragulescu crew, and a man whose temper had outlived 3 different therapists his own family had tried to send him to. "Sit, Caspian." Dimitrios tapped a thick folder against the desk. "We caught a break, a big one." Caspian sat, keeping his face neutral. "What kind of break, boss?" Our friend in records pulled some sealed paperwork. Dimitrios's grin showed too many teeth. "We found Marchetti's ghost. He's got a daughter, a real one, hiding in plain sight, taking cello lessons like a good little student." Caspian's blood went cold, though his hands stayed loose on his knees. "Is that right?" Dimitrios flipped the folder open and slid a surveillance photo across the desk. Audrey leaving the conservatory, cello case slung over her shoulder, and in the blurred background near the doors, unmistakably, Caspian. "We've got eyes on her, and look at this, you're already in place." Smart kid. Doing recon on the enemy's bloodline without anyone even asking you to. Caspian swallowed against a dry throat. "She doesn't know who she is. She thinks her father was some businessman." "Who cares what she thinks?" "Marchetti cares, and that's all that matters. We take her tomorrow night. Drive her down to the cold storage yard and call her father. Tell him he signs over the eastern docks, or he gets his daughter back 1 finger at a time." "Tomorrow," Caspian said, his voice hollow. "Reyes runs a skeleton detail on Fridays. You get close, isolate her. We roll up, put 2 in Reyes's head, and she's in the van. Do this clean, Caspian, and you're not a courier anymore. You're maid." Caspian left the cold storage facility feeling like the air outside had thinned to nothing. If the Dragulescus took Marchetti's daughter, it would set off a war that would turn the harbourfront into a graveyard. And Audrey, sweet, exhausted, completely innocent Audrey, who worried about whether she could afford a new E-string, would be the first to bleed for it. He found her near the ferry terminal at the foot of Bay Street, wrapped in her oversized coat, a paper cup of tea cooling in her hands. The pier was nearly empty, the cold keeping the tourists indoors. "Caspian?" Her face lit up, then faltered the second she saw his expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost. We need to leave. Right now." He took her by the shoulders too hard, and she flinched. "What? Why? You're hurting me. I'm sorry." He loosened his grip but didn't let go, scanning the waterfront. 50 yards back, Anton Reyes leaned against a lamppost, a cigarette burning unattended between his fingers. Marchetti's watchdog, on duty as always. "Caspian, you're scaring me," Audrey said, pulling back. "What is going on with you lately? I keep seeing the same men everywhere. Those guys from the conservatory. I swear one of them followed me to the streetcar last week. You're not imagining it." His voice shook, just slightly. Audrey, there's a lot about your life, about your family, that you don't know. Before he could say another word, a black Suburban rounded the foot of the pier, headlights dark, and accelerated straight toward them. Dimitrios hadn't waited for Friday. "Get down," Caspian roared. The side doors slid open before the SUV had even stopped. 3 men in balaclavas spilling out with suppressed weapons raised. In the same heartbeat, Anton Reyes dropped his cigarette and drew a heavy revolver from beneath his coat, moving with a speed that defied his bulk. Audrey screamed as the first muffled shots shattered the glass of a nearby ticket kiosk. Caspian threw his arms around her and drove them both to the frozen concrete as 2 of the city's deadliest organizations opened fire over their heads. The pier became a chaos of shattered glass and ricochet sparks. Caspian pinned Audrey behind the steel base of a lamppost, while bullets chewed through the kiosk they'd been standing beside seconds earlier. She pressed her palms over her ears, gasping, her cello case forgotten somewhere on the ice. 50 feet away, Anton Reyes proved exactly why Victor Marchetti paid him what he did. He didn't take cover. He advanced, raising his revolver with a calm that belonged to a much younger man, and the first shot took the Suburban's driver clean through the windshield. The vehicle swerved and slammed into a concrete bollard. "Stay down," Caspian ordered, all the softness gone from his voice. Before the Dragulescu organization, before the violin cover story, he'd spent 3 years in the Canadian Armed Forces as a combat engineer, a past nobody in his current life knew about. Muscle memory took over. He drew a pistol from inside his coat and put 2 rounds into a masked gunman climbing out of the wrecked SUV, dropping him to the ice. Reyes's head snapped toward him, eyes widening. The quiet music student was returning fire like a soldier. The remaining gunman laid down, suppressing fire, forcing Reyes behind a concrete planter. A round clipped the stone and sent a shard into his shoulder. He dropped his revolver, blood blooming fast through his coat. "Reyes is hit," Caspian yelled, hauling Audrey up by the arm. "When I start shooting, you run to that planter and you drag him behind it. You know first aid. Keep him from bleeding out. I don't even know who he is. He's your father's man, and right now he's the only reason we're still breathing. Go." Caspian stepped out from cover, exposing himself, laying down fire that forced the gunman back behind the ruined Suburban. Audrey scrambled across the ice on pure adrenaline and slid in beside Reyes, who looked at her through a haze of pain and something like awe. "Miss Marchetti," he wheezed. "Shut up and hold still." She tore off her scarf and pressed it hard against the wound at his collarbone, her hands shaking but sure, 3 years of pre-med muscle memory taking over where panic should have. Reyes hissed but nodded, grim respect flickering across his face. Sirens rose in the distance. The remaining attackers abandoned their dead and bolted for a second vehicle near the loading docks. Caspian half-carried Reyes to his own armored Tahoe, Audrey climbing in beside him to keep pressure on the wound, and they peeled out onto the Gardiner just as the first cruisers reached the pier. In the back seat, Audrey's hands were slick with blood, and the pieces of the night were assembling themselves in her mind whether she wanted them to or not. "Miss Marchetti," she said, tasting the name like ash. "Who is my father?" Reyes, eyes closed against the headrest, answered in a voice gone thin with blood loss. "Victor Marchetti. He runs the harbourfront, half the port, half the city council with it. Your mother made him swear to keep you out of it. Bought off 3 different officials just to keep your birth record sealed. I've had eyes on you since you were 6 years old, kid." Audrey felt the floor of her stomach drop away. Her whole life, the loans, the second-hand cello, the quiet grief of her mother's funeral had been a curated illusion. She was the heir to an empire of money and violence she'd never asked for. She lifted her eyes to the rearview mirror, meeting Caspian's. "And you? Have you had eyes on me since I was 6'2"s? His knuckles whitened on the wheel. "No, I work for the Dragulescus. I'm a courier. Dimitrios found out you existed through a contact in records. I was supposed to get close to you, find your weaknesses. They were coming for you tonight to use you as leverage against your father's port contracts." Audrey recoiled like she'd been struck. The quiet, careful boy who brought her tea between rehearsals had been an operative the entire time, sent to study her like a target. "You lied to me," she said, tears cutting through the grime on her face. "I did." His voice cracked. "But I didn't let them take you. I just burned my whole life down to stop it. They'll kill me for what I did on that pier, Audrey. But I couldn't let them touch you." "Pull over," she said, her voice trembling but finding something solid underneath the shake. "We're not safe yet." I said, "Pull over." He pulled the Tahoe into an empty underground loading bay near the financial district and turned in his seat, braced for her to run. Instead, she sat very still, looking down at the blood drying on her hands, blood from a man who'd just taken a bullet meant for her father's enemies. She thought of her mother, who had lied every single day to keep her safe, only for that safety to turn out to be paper-thin. She wasn't Audrey Lindqvist, struggling grad student anymore. She was a Marchetti, and she was being hunted. She looked up, and something in her hazel eyes had gone hard and clear like glass under pressure. "You know how the Dragolescas operate. Their roots, their people, their weaknesses. I know all of it." "Good." Her voice dropped flat and certain. "Take me to my father." The Marchetti state sat behind a stone wall in the bridle path, gates wrought iron, grounds patrolled by men who didn't bother pretending to be gardeners. When Caspian's bullet-pocked Tahoe rolled up to the gatehouse, a dozen armed men surrounded it within seconds. 10 minutes later, Audrey stood in a study that smelled of cedar and old paper, facing a man in his late 50s with silver at his temples and the unmistakable weight of absolute authority in his shoulders. Victor Marchetti's composure cracked the instant he saw her. He was looking at the ghost of the nurse he'd loved 20 years ago, and at the failure he'd never let himself examine too closely. "Audrey," he started forward. "Don't." She held up a blood-stained hand, and the gesture stopped him cold. "My mother is dead. You left us to pretend I was safe, and tonight I was almost taken and killed by a man named Dimitrios Marchenko. The illusion's over." Victor's eyes flared with something dangerous and paternal at once. He turned that fury on Caspian, who stood by the door flanked by armed men. "And this Dragolescu garbage, why is he still breathing in my house?" "Because he saved my life," Audrey said, stepping between them. "And because we're going to use him to end the Dragolescu organization. Tonight." Victor's expression shifted, assessing her now, not as the daughter he'd failed, but as someone who carried his blood and, apparently, his instincts. For the next 2 hours, the study became a war room. Audrey, drawing on a brain trained to absorb complex systems under pressure, helped map strategy alongside her father's people. Caspian supplied the intelligence. Blind spots in the Dragolescu security, the timing of their movements, the layout of the cold storage compound. Nobody else had ever gotten close enough to chart. At 3 a.m, the plan moved. Audrey sat in the back of a decoy sedan, wearing a vest beneath a borrowed coat, Caspian beside her with a rifle across his lap, parked exposed in an alley near the port lands. He dialed a burner number. "You've got 30 seconds. Dimitrios's voice snarled through the line. "I have the girl," Caspian said, manufacturing panic into his voice. Reyes went feral, started shooting everything that moved. I grabbed her in the chaos. I'm pinned down 3 blocks from the yard. I need extraction now or we both lose her. A pause. Greed 1. Keep her quiet. I'm coming myself. The line went dead. Audrey's heart slammed against her ribs. He bought it. Caspian racked the charging handle on his rifle, then looked at her, something soft breaking through the calm. "Whatever happens next, I'm sorry for how we met, but I'm not sorry I met you." She reached forward and gripped his shoulder. Hard. "We finished this together." Minutes later, a convoy of black SUVs roared out of the cold storage compound, Dimitrios leading the charge, greedy and certain of his prize. As the convoy turned onto the narrow road toward the alley, the trap closed. A delivery truck reversed violently from a side street, T-boning the lead vehicle and sealing the road. Before anyone inside could reach for a door handle, Marchetti's men opened fire from the rooftops above. It wasn't a fight. It was an ending. Audrey watched through tinted glass as the organization that had hunted her was dismantled in under 3 minutes. A week later, she stood on the balcony of a high-rise overlooking Lake Ontario, the water flat and silver under a pale winter sun. She wore a tailored black coat, her hair pulled back, and she was no longer cramming for a jury that no longer mattered. The cello had been packed into storage along with the rest of her old life. The glass door slid open behind her. Caspian stepped out, dressed sharp now, moving like a man who no longer needed to hide in doorways. He'd been formally brought into the Marchetti organization, answering only to her. "Your father called," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The Eastern Port contracts are signed. The Dragulescu territories are fully absorbed. Logistics division is yours." "Good," she said quietly, and took a sip from the glass in her hand. "And the conservatory?" he asked. "Bought outright, endowed in my mother's name." A small, unbreakable smile crossed her face. "No one touches it, ever." She reached out, and his fingers found hers. She wasn't just the boss's daughter anymore. She was the one he answered to. And in a city built on quiet violence and quieter money, she had finally found someone she could simply sit beside.